Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of May 1st, and this is your Monday briefing. The House will not be in session this week and is scheduled to return May 9th. The Senate will be in session this week with committee hearings on FY24 appropriations continuing. There will be some economic news this week, with the Federal Open Markets Committee possibly making a monetary policy announcement on Wednesday and the April jobs report coming out on Friday. But the key issue at the moment is the debt ceiling. Last week, the House passed a bill to temporarily suspend the debt ceiling and reduce federal spending. Rohit Kumar joins us to discuss the latest developments around the debt limit discussions. Rohit, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So Rohit, the Republican House passed bill is not expected to be taken up by the Democratic Senate. But we're curious, does the House passage put some pressure on the president to begin negotiation?
I think it does, if indirectly, and I think you'll see that sort of show up in a couple of ways. You'll start to see even more congressional Democrats, and House Democrats have already started to do this, but I think the volume of it will grow. House Democrats calling on the president to enter into negotiations with Republicans on the debt limit. In the Senate, you've got Senator Manchin has been already, even before the House passed the bill, very vocal that the president should be engaging in negotiations with Republicans on these questions. Of course, the politics for Senator Manchin are a little bit different. He's up for re-election in West Virginia, a state that former President Trump carried by 40 points in 2020. So his politics are somewhat distinct from the rest of his colleagues. But I do think there's this it's going to prove unsustainable in the long run for the president to say, yeah, I'm just not going to talk to you about this stuff. And frankly, it would be sort of a break from historical precedent. We typically have some sort of negotiation when there's divided government on debt limits. And there is actually sort of what I think is a relatively easy way out for President Biden, which is not to have just Speaker McCarthy come to the White House and start a conversation, but maybe to bring all four of the congressional leaders to the White House to have a conversation. So it's not, they are talking, but it's not exactly the negotiation that Speaker McCarthy wants, but they at least are beginning to have a conversation.
Makes sense. So the House passed bill also eliminates many clean energy tax credits that were enacted just last year in the Inflation Reduction Act. What are you hearing from companies that might otherwise be gearing up to take advantage of some of those incentives?
Yeah, so initially, I think there was a fair bit of concern that, are these things actually at risk of going away? But I think over time and in the sort of the aftermath of the vote, it's become increasingly clear these Inflation Reduction Act credits are not going to be repealed, not in this Congress, not with President Biden still in office. And frankly, even if you had a Republican in the White House who might be more inclined to assign a bill into law that repeals some of these provisions, I don't think you have 60 votes in the Senate for this scale of repeal. Maybe on a targeted basis, some of the credits you could see being tweaked. The revenue estimates or the revenue loss associated with these provisions is now turns out to be much greater than had been previously anticipated, almost 2x the original estimates, because of the guidance that's come out, but also just the sort of interest and uptake in the credits is proving to be much larger than had been anticipated ex ante. So, I could see a future world maybe where if Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the White House, you could see some capping of the credits or something along those lines to bring it back down sort of on the order of magnitude that was originally envisioned when the bill was first signed into law. But, the wholesale repeal is just not on the table. And I actually think that even a bunch of House Republicans who voted for it did so knowing full well that this was never going to become law. And had they thought it was sort of had a realistic chance of becoming law, they would have either been a little bit more tailored in their approach, or they would have at least included some offsetting tax decreases rather, because as written, it's a big tax increase bill, right? You're repealing a bunch of incentives, and that shows as a significant tax increase on the Joint Committee table.
House Republicans separately are working on an economic package that might include expired business tax breaks. How does this proposed legislation fit in with the debt ceiling discussions?
Yeah, it actually really doesn't fit in with the debt ceiling discussions. I mean, that proposal, they'll have to make a decision about whether they offset the revenue loss associated with addressing, and I think it's going to tackle 174, research capitalization and amortization, 163J, the interest limitation rule, which currently is 30% of EBIT, but previously been 30% of EBITDA, and full expensing, which is now 80%, so as opposed to 100%, and sort of restoring it at 100%, maybe through the end of 2025. So those provisions, all told, probably run you about $40 to $50 billion of revenue loss over the ensuing decade. So they'll have to make an initial sort of judgment about whether they're going to offset the cost those extensions or not. And if not, then definitely that doesn't sort of jive with the debt limit, which is obviously about reducing the deficit, reducing the debt, and unoffset tax increases move in the other direction. And even if they decide to offset them, at the end of the day, those offsets probably don't have sufficient bipartisan political support. There's just not a lot of low-hanging fruit to pay for things. So I think it's really almost like a collateral exercise, and we may not actually see it until the debt limit issue is more fully resolved, to avoid the sort of message inconsistency between deficit reduction on debt limit and perhaps deficit increasing, but what they will say is pro-growth tax policy. And maybe there's an argument that the economic growth effects help, if not fully pay for the tax relief, at least partially offset some of the revenue loss associated with those proposals.
And then finally, Rohit, back to the debt ceiling. Treasury and the Congressional Budget Office are expected to provide updated projections of the so-called X date, when the government's ability to meet its obligations using extraordinary measures runs out. Some analysts are saying this could be as soon as June. In that brief interim, what are some actions companies might consider taking?
Yeah, look, I mean, unfortunately, this is not a topic that is sort of significantly amenable to business community input. Everybody knows it's an important issue. Everybody knows that there's no CEO in America that wants the U.S. to default on its debt, nor even come close to defaulting on our debt, because even getting close introduces a fair bit of uncertainty, creates market turmoil, risk of downgrade for U.S. debt, which has knock-on effects for the credit rating for businesses who are also issuing debt. And so I think Congress is well aware of that. It's probably valuable just to kind of continue to press upon the importance of the topic, but without getting into the nitty-gritty details of what the transaction should look like and what offsets should be available and what the spending cap should be, the things that they're going to negotiate, because really that's for Congress to decide. The one thing I will say that I continue to say to folks is just be prepared for this to go down to the wire. Like, we'll get an X date. It'll either be before or after June 15th. If it's after June 15th, then it'll probably take us all the way through the month of July. But it's entirely possible that this is a topic that Congress has to address between Memorial Day and mid-June. And so, they will take it to the wire because that's just the way that the place is organized, and that's where the institutional pressures will push them. So we should all just be, if nothing else, emotionally prepared for this thing to go down to, if not the last several hours, at least the last several days. I would be pretty surprised if we did this weeks before the deadline. That's just not the way Congress has done this in recent memory. And so it's more about being prepared. Make sure you're communicating with your stakeholders. We know this is coming. The overwhelmingly likelihood is that it gets resolved favorably, i.e. we don't default. But it's something that you need to just pay attention to and be ready, because there will be moments where it will be uncomfortable.
That makes sense. Terrific advice as always. Thank you very much for your time and insights, Rohit. Appreciate you being with us.
Always happy to be here.
Be sure to check out the latest Week in Review with Janice Mays, included in the description of this episode, and stay tuned for this Friday's Week in Review. As always, thank you for spending this time with us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.